It's my pleasure to welcome to the Medics Money podcast, Dr. Tony Goldstone. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much for having me, Tommy. Thanks for the invite.
No, it's great to have you. It's been a long time in arranging this, aligning two doctors' schedules. We also got Andy Pow here as well.
Yeah, hi everybody.
So most of our listeners are, I like to think, more financially astute, and most of them will probably know who you are, Tony. But for the benefit of those people that don't know who you are, can we get a quick intro?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Tony Goldstone. I'm a radiologist up in East Yorkshire, and I'm sure we'll kind of get into the history of kind of how I got where I am. I'm now an expert on NHS Pensions and taxation, and have been really kind of heavily involved in lots of the changes over the last few years and all of the stuff that's going on.
Awesome. I really want to get into how you sort of transition from radiologist to pension expert. Andy, I think most podcast listeners know you, but do you want to give yourself a big up?
Yeah, hi, I'm a medical specialist accountant. I've been advising doctors in all forms now for, sadly, over 30 years. I don't think I'm that old, but I feel like that sometimes. And pensions have been such a big problem over the last 10 years, I would say. It seems to be all we seem to be talking about in the tax world to do with doctors.
Definitely. And that's a nice little segue into Tony explaining, you were a radiologist, or you still are a radiologist, but at some point you got started and interested in pensions. So take us back to when you were, I hate to say this because people say like just a GP all the time, but when you were just a radiologist, what got you first interested in pensions?
So I'm going to rewind the clock a little bit further, actually, Tommy. So roll back to kind of school days, and it won't surprise you that I was a bit of a nerd and a bit of an IT freak in school. And I helped build a kind of matching database in the career service at school to kind of match people to placements. And as part of that, I was doing kind of typical medicine A-levels. But as part of that, at the time, a report came out saying that the best career in terms of pay, prospects, and everything else was becoming an actuary. So up until handing in UCA forms, I had two UCA forms. I had one for medicine and one for actuarial sciences, and I'd done all the work experience and all the rest of it, and probably got pressed a little bit too much from parents to put in the medical one rather than the actuarial one. And then, did medical school and all the usual guff that people do at medical school, and really wasn't interested at all in pensions. In fact, it's so much so I didn't even know about the Pensions Day of Action in 2012, which probably reflects a little bit on, what the BMA was like kind of back in that day, and pensions wasn't kind of a major focus of it. So I just didn't know anything about it. And it all kind of came to life for me when a colleague who was at a similar stage of his career, just a couple of years older than me, walked in clutching a brown envelope. And I knew that I'd seen one before, because actually the year before I had a brown envelope and just assumed it was the scheme telling me how good the pension is, etc. And I just filed it away, didn't do anything with it. But he had a distinctly pale face, and he had this distinctly pale face because he'd spent some money and spoken to somebody like Andy, and his accountant had told him that he had a 5-figure bill to pay. And then the very next day on my doormat, I had a brown envelope. And that's when I realised that I had a bill to pay. And if I'll read you a post from 2016 on Doctors.net UK, which is kind of where my learning journey started. So first post here, go easy on me. I didn't know the first thing about annual allowance until a month ago. It transpires I will have a significant and unexpected bill to pay after a couple of recent pay rises, even after using all my carry forward. And I think very shortly thereafter, it was a really steep learning curve. And because of my interest in IT and modelling and stuff, I started, the beginnings of kind of calculators, etc. And, as they say, the rest is history. So I went from knowing nothing to needing to know about it for my own position, to then kind of becoming a leading expert. And so I realised that there just weren't any tools out there to be able to work out your position and crucially predict what the future might look like for you. So I started to develop them. I did a free tool that was kind of heavily involved with DN UK back in the day, and that had over 10,000 downloads. But I was really worried back then, as a young doctor who I think was 40, that this was going to absolutely destroy the NHS. And so I started getting a bit political. So I started writing to, MPs and others about it. I was encouraging others on DNUK to also write to their MPs. And I started being a bit noisy that the unions weren't really, all of the medical unions weren't really doing anything about it either. So at the time, BMA didn't have a pensions committee. It had kind of fallen into abeyance. So I started making a bit of noise to the BMA as well and kind of questioning their, policy making and how sound it was in terms of kind of modelling. And then I was approached by both of the unions, the BMA and HCSA, so they could kind of onboard their tool to use it as a member benefit, and went with the BMA because I thought that's where I could probably exert most influence.
I've spoken with thousands of doctors through Medics Money, and one topic that comes up more than you'd think: scrubs. Most of us have worn some pretty rough ones. Boxy, itchy, uncomfortable, never really made with our comfort in mind. That's why I wear figs. They're comfortable, durable, did I mention also antimicrobial, and made with the details that matter. Plenty of pockets, a great fit, and yeah, I think they actually look good too. Figs also have super comfortable underscrubs, so you can layer up for those cold winter shifts, and I'm loving the jogger scrubs for that comfortable jogger bottom feel whilst you work. And because we're all about smart money decisions at Medics Money, you can get 15% off your first order at wearfigs.com with the code FIGSUK. That's wearfigs.com with the code FIGSUK for 15% off. Awesome. That is an awesome summary of what must have been a tremendous amount of work and learning. And I do remember back in the day on the Doctors.net UK, like there would be iterations of I think it was like a Google sheet at one stage where it would like iterate and it'd be like, this bit's been updated, this bit's been updated. It was really cool to see that. I guess like when you got that brown envelope, what was your kind of feeling about being taxed on, I mean, we're getting into the weeds already, but you're being taxed on a benefit which you may hopefully live long enough to receive, right? But what was your thoughts about
that? I have no issue with taxation, and I do generally feel that those with the broader shoulders should pay the most tax. I'm completely open about that. But what was just completely messed up about the taper was that you could do things for no benefit of your pension. So you could do non-pensionable overtime, and that could tip you over a tax cliff into paying, over £10,000 in tax. And for me, that was just completely nuts. And the point where I really realised that I could no longer kind of safely make noise without it being a union was when, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from a letter that I wrote to the FT that was published. So, unfortunately, the 2015 scheme creates perverse incentives for consultants not to do additional work. In some cases, marginal tax exceed 100%. So the consultant would literally be paying himself to do additional work, retire early, and for some may receive higher pensions for contributing less and going part-time. And I think it was at that kind of point I realised that, as an individual, I can't be putting out the message that, you can get a higher pension by going part-time, because there's serious workforce implications for that. And so that was kind of when I realised that absolutely this needs to be done in conjunction with a union, so I've got access to the government. And in fact, prior to me onboarding with the BMA and getting involved with them, the BMA essentially had never had any direct discussions with the Treasury. And all of this modelling kind of opened up all of that because, government realised and kind of all these arm's length bodies realised that there is a genuine problem here that needs fixing. And that ultimately led to, after, years of work, changes to the taxation system, which was obviously very welcomed.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about those changes in a bit. But I think maybe why, some people didn't know that it was a thing is that you would never think that going to work, doing more work, would result in actually ending up with less money than if you stayed home and done nothing. But as we're about to explain and discuss, there are these perverse incentives in the system which encourage that. And that is just fundamentally flawed. Like, if you go to work and do more work, you should pay a fair share of tax, but you should fundamentally get more than if you take home more than if you hadn't done it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Andy, at the same time, like that Tony was getting his envelope and his colleague was getting his envelope, brown envelope, the notorious brown envelope, from an advisor point of view, like, how was it for you? What was going on in the advisor world?
It's pretty similar, really, in that, we could predict what was happening. I remember going to an ASMA conference, I don't know, around about 2015, well, maybe 2016, after the glorious budget, which brought all this sort of tapering in. And a colleague of mine on ASMA, Luke Bennett, produced this graph on screen. It was a GP-based one. And that included things like student loan in there as well. But, the annual allowance, the tapering cliff just showed that suddenly you got a GP, who was having some take-home pay, suddenly reversing to a position actually working extra sessions meant they were actually losing money. So you were paying to go to work. And that was just, absolute nonsense. And it's, led to a whole heap of problems afterwards in people trying to play around with sessions they were working, people cutting out activity, and caused a lot of problems. So I got involved from the ASMA route, and my role then was writing to government. And my office at home, I could probably paper the wall with the letters we wrote over the years and the responses from some, pretty high people who got to fairly high levels of power within the Conservative governments at the time. But they were all fairly bland, saying it's not a problem, it's not a problem, it's not a problem. Even, had a GP client who's was quite close to George Osborne. He was a friend of George Osborne, so I wrote them a paper and said, look, give this to George Osborne. This is going to cause a major problem. And it did cause a major problem until, we got onto a fairly partial fix, as I would say. It's not a total fix, but I'm sure Tony will talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to get into the detail because of the, the expertise that we have with us today, which is amazing. But before we do that, Tony, shall we just start with some the basics of how pensions are taxed, and then kind of start with the basics so that people can keep up, and then get right into the details. So about how pensions are taxed and why that may or may not still be a problem.
Okay, so there's two types of pensions. Okay, so there's DC, or defined contribution, and that's what pretty much everyone except a lucky few have got in the private sector. And then there's DB, which some of the kind of bigger companies have still got DB schemes, and that's what's also found in the public sector. So with DC, things are very straightforward. You're given a limit, which is the annual allowance, and that's how much you or your employer can put into your pension, and then you don't go above that limit. And this was never, we believe, aimed to be targeted at the public sector. This was aimed to stop somebody, a banker in London, in the city of London, earning £1 million, and then them also getting £1 million squirreled into their pension with tax relief at the highest rate, which was clearly, an unfair use of taxpayers' monies. And so I think it did need to be limit. I don't have fundamentally a problem with that limit. But in DB, it works completely different. So in DB, you have a defined benefit. So how much your pension grows is nothing to do with how much you put in. It's nothing to do with how much your employer puts in, but rather it's everything to do with your pay and your service history. So that's what a defined benefit pension is. And there's two ways principally of limiting that, or there were two ways of limiting that. The first was something called the lifetime allowance. And so I like to think of this in terms of a jug of water. Yeah. So the lifetime allowance peaked at 1.8 million, which meant you could have a pot worth 1.8 million before, if you filled it above that, you would then pay tax. And that tax was 55% from a lump sum, or 25% if it's applied to your pension, because your pension itself is taxable. So they're actually the same. It's just reflecting that your pension is taxed. So that was the lifetime allowance. And actually, the lifetime allowance probably was a pretty good fit for defined benefit pension, because you know what the benefit is going to be at the point of retirement. But the annual allowance is how fast you can fill that jug. Yeah. So that peaked at 255,000, or if we're thinking in water terms, 255 mils. So back in the day when the jug was 1.8 litres and the beaker was 255 mils, no one ever paid any tax who were doctors, because you could fill that in a tax efficient way, and very few people got to the point of it being 1.8 million, so it just wasn't an issue. But when they started to reduce that jug, so 1.8 litres became 1 litre or £1 million, which is what the lifetime allowance was at. And then you started also reducing the rate at which you could fill that. So the annual allowance, that reduced to 50 and then to £40,000. Then that started hitting high earners in the public sector. So by far the biggest group of highest earners in the public sector are consultants and GPs. So to add insult to injury, there were also kind of two other bits that didn't really apply to the private sector. So the first is something called tiering. Yeah. So your £1 million banker who's squirreling £1 million into his pension gets the full rate of relief on that. But his secretary, who's on, 25k, only got basic rate relief. So it seems jolly unfair that he's getting the high rate relief and the secretary's getting basic rate relief. In the NHS, almost all of the tax relief is reduced by tiering. Yeah. Back in the day, we paid 14.5%. The lowest rate was 5%. So that differential between the highest rate and the lowest rate strips away that tax relief. So you've had the tax relief taken away by tiering, and then we were getting hit by both the AA and the LTA, yeah, which is just completely unfair. But add to that was just the worst piece of legislation ever brought in, which was the tapered annual allowance, yeah. And the tapered annual allowance meant that instead of getting your full allowance at 40k, they would apply two tests. So the first was called the threshold test, and that was essentially what's your taxable income from all sources. And the initial limit was 110k. And at the time, 110k happened to be the average pay pretty much for consultants and GPs. So it meant straight away that half of the senior medics were going to be subject to tapering if they failed the second test, which is called adjusted income. And so the adjusted income test is they took your threshold income, so your taxable pay, and then they added in your deemed growth, which was derived from some crazy formula that basically looks at your pension growth above inflation, and they times it by 16 or 19. And then if that was above adjusted income, then 150k, the limit, then you would pay tax. And so we had a big problem back in 17, 18, 18, 19. We had waiting lists that were, getting crazy high at over 6 million. Of course, they're higher than that now. And we had consultants and others saying, well, I can't do overtime because of tapering, because I'm going to be paying to work. So, government knew they had to do something. And so what they did was to tweak the taper. So they moved those two limits of 110 and 150 to the right of the curve to 200 and then 240. And it's now 200 and 260 with the subsequent changes. So that's taken a lot of people, but not everyone, out of the tapered annual allowance. And I think one of the problems, when we discuss the taper with people, when we discussed the taper with the pensions minister a couple of weeks ago, is it's quite difficult to get people to have a lot of sympathy for people earning 200k, right? And I can see that. But the problem that the government have is that if they've got waiting lists, and it happens that some of the key people to, deliver a hip or a knee replacement or a cardiac angiography or read your scans or to increase, GP access, if some of those people are earning that money and they're being disincentivized by not wanting to fall over the cliff, you've got a problem. So, the underlying problem is that the taper is still a very stupid, poorly designed, destructive, tax cliff that creates these perverse incentives. So that's the kind of where we were with AA. And then we had the LTA. So our preference, I think, always in the BMA was to try and say, well, look, AA is the thing that really doesn't work in a defined benefit scheme, and that's what we want to go. And government instead took the bigger action on the LTA. So the LTA was essentially abolished. The charge was abolished in 2023, and then the LTA completely went the year later. So at least it means that we don't have that kind of triple taxation, if you like. We don't have tiering AA and LTA. We've now only got tiering, and tiering is less steep after some of the modelling that we did to say that tiering was really unfair for higher earners because of pension taxation, and we don't have the LTA on top. So it's a much better landscape than it was. And then the final thing that also happened in that March 23 budget is they increased the normal annual allowance for those people that aren't tapered from 40k to 60k, and that takes most doctors in most years out of the annual allowance. But obviously, if that just withers on the vine and stays at 60k, then people will run into that problem in the future. And we've still got a problem because of the stupid way that annual allowance works, and it assesses it based on your earnings in the year, that some people still have AA problems in years where they get a pay rise or an increment.
Hopefully everyone's now up to speed on that. I mean, that what your last statement, which is that some people could still have a problem when they get an increment or a pay rise, that kind of leads us into talking a little bit maybe about how the growth is calculated. Because at the start you said you've got the DC pension, right, which is defined contribution. That's for most people, for example, bankers. And then you've got the DB pension, defined benefit, which is NHS. And the growth, that the annual allowance is calculated differently. So for DC, you said it's just the amount that you put in. Super simple. If you're a billionaire banker, you just put up to the annual allowance in, taking account of the taper, of course, and you're done. But in the NHS, it's not the amount that you put in, it's the growth. And then that kind of links into what you just said about this weird situation where certain things, getting an increment or handing back a car or whatever, gives you this kind of growth. And growth is this like mythical thing where you're sat there thinking, how's my growth? And then the envelope arrives, you're like, oh, that's how my growth is.
Yeah, so great question. So essentially, this mythical growth figure isn't a completely random number generator, which some people think it is, but it is actually based on what they assess your pension at the end of the tax year to be and how that relates to the previous year plus inflation. So it's basically assessed at the rate of 16 times pension plus lump sum. So for the 1995 system, it's got a lump sum of 3 times pension. It's 19 times the pension growth. And for the 2015 scheme and the 2008 scheme, it's based on 16 times the growth in pension above inflation. Now, one of the things that we fought very hard for, and I've been fighting for, in fact, many years before I even started with BMA, was something called negative growth to be accounted for. So what they used to do is they used to separately assess your growth in the 2015 scheme and in the 1995 scheme. Now, if they'd given you a sub-inflationary pay rise, and doctors have had quite a lot of those over the last 15 years, instead of giving you negative growth, if it hadn't kept up with inflation, the Finance Act zeroed off that negative growth. And so instead of you giving you a credit, if you like, for that negative growth in 1995 and then allowing to offset that against the 2015 growth, they just zeroed it off and then still tax you on the 2015, which was just scandalous, right? And I used to, tweet and in social media and elsewhere, call it pension theft, and that upset a few people in the BMA and elsewhere. And so I got legal advice on it within the BMA, and they said, Tony, you can say it's pension theft, because it was pension theft. Essentially, they were depriving you of something that you shouldn't be paying tax on. And thankfully, after lots of work by lots of people, not just within the BMA, so me and Andy worked quite closely on this in the background, and ASMA wrote to the Treasury and others, and NHS employees wrote to the Treasury and others, and all of the unions kind of fought for it as well. Thankfully, that was also changed in the 2023 March budget. So now, if your scheme goes down in 1993, in the 1995 section, you can use that to offset the 2015 growth. It's not the perfect solution that I wanted. I wanted it to be able to be, carried over if you had an overall negative year like I had last year, for example. But it's a ton better than where we were. So, there's been a lot of movement in pensions. It's, lots of people still complain about pension taxation, and, they're right to. But, AA has gone from 40 to 60. The taper has softened significantly. The taper is also affected by this negative PIA issue, because obviously the adjusted income calculation is impacted by the technical changes that affect how it's being calculated. the LTA's in the bin, and tiering is less steep than it used to be. So we've made a lot of noise, we've had a lot of movement, and that's great. Are we at the place we want to be forevermore? Absolutely not. And we're still working on some things, and we're still trying to influence government on some things to make it better. But clearly we're in a difficult time at the moment, as a nation financially, and moving significantly on this is going to be a challenge. But it's absolutely something that we're continuing to lobby on, particularly pointing out areas where tax policy is just stupid, right? These tax cliffs, and it's not just a 200k tax cliff with a taper. There's other tax cliffs in the system that just are complete nonsense. Like at 100k, you go into those stupid marginal rates as you lose your personal allowance, and if you've got kids you're paying childcare for as well, you lose that. It's just complete disincentives, and those disincentives are really bad for HMT as well, because if you've got a load of people that are restricting their income, they're also paying less tax. If they're trying to sit at 99 and not take the promotion, or if they're not going to do all the overtime and take on additional responsibility at the other end of the spectrum, that's not good for the government either. So tax cliffs are a really bad thing that I would like to get rid of, both within pensions and the other tax cliffs that are in the system as well. They just make no sense to me.
I think there was one other change that also came in, which was particularly helpful for GPs as part of the lobbying, really, was we had this inflation disconnect issue that was going on at the time. So as Tony quite rightly pointed out, basically from RC's viewpoint, your opening pension position gets uplifted by inflation and then compares against your closing position. And what was happening is HMRC were using an inflation figure that was a year different from the NHS pension uplift, which is fine when inflation's fairly level. That's not a problem because you're using the same inflation figure. But for GPs particularly, and this would then flow into potentially the 2015 scheme for all doctors, where you get a significant rise or significant decline in inflation, which is what we've seen over the last few years, that would have caused some pretty horrendous annual allowance tax charges. And I remember at the time looking at my wife's position, who's a GP, and she wasn't a high earning GP at all, as I continually pointed out to her throughout her career. But even at the very low end of GPs, like potentially when we had that sort of super hyperinflation, when it jumped up to 10, 11% at that point in time, she would have had an annual allowance tax bill. It was crazy. So one of the benefits that's also come out of this is we've got that bit's been simplified. Still will cause problems, as probably Tony will allude to probably in a minute, with pay uplifts and how that interacts with inflation, particularly in the hospital sector. But actually, from the GP perspective, I think it will make it a lot more manageable in terms of trying to predict where people's growth is going to be going forward.
Yeah, I mean, just on that GP thing, I'll never forget being contacted by a GP in Scotland who, was kind of towards the end of his career. He was kind of, mid, late 50s. He'd kind of stepped back from a full-time partnered role to being less hours as kind of part of winding down into retirement. And, I think his earnings were going to be 60k, and is predicted, we brought out this modeler and, to try and influence the government to realise the problem. And his, because he'd had quite a reasonable built-up pension from being a partner for 30 odd years, his predicted tax charge was like 100k. And he was in tears, and he said, my only option is to retire. And that's just crazy policy, right? So I'm really pleased again that the government listened to us on that and said, yeah, this is fair dues and we need to fix that.
That's a kind of really good summary of the issues. And I think once we're talking about inflation disconnect, we've reached pensions bingo. Can we bring the level back down a bit simpler? And I'm going to ask both of you the question I always ask Andy. He knows what's coming, because I think we've got lots of young doctors listening to this and lots of old doctors like me and Tony. If you could swap your NHS pension for a private pension, would you or not?
I mean, that's the world's easiest question. And the answer is not in a million years. And so it's still a great scheme. And, I've always had at the top of my Twitter handle only one piece of pensions advice. And that's that, junior or resident doctors should never come out of the scheme, because pound for pound, you get the most out of the pension scheme by those early pounds. It's like, all investing with compound interest. It's about starting early. So absolutely not. So it's just crucially important that people stay in the scheme, and we carry on working with the government to try and make sure that they stop tinkering with the pension scheme and do something about the crazy taxes. But absolutely stay in the scheme.
Yeah, I see this as really important because there's lots of data showing that opt-outs are increasing in the NHS pension, and unfortunately in those younger cohorts of workers. And of course, with the pay cuts and everything, it's probably an affordability issue, which is absolutely, devastating, really. But I think it's just really important to just think about what Tony just said there. Like, yes, there are problems in this scheme, and yes, it's complicated, and things like the growth and inflation disconnect are pretty annoying, but just think about what Tony just said there. Andy, you have a private pension. Would you like mine or Tony's or both of our NHS pensions? And if so, why?
Well, I'd definitely like both. If you could combine them, that'd be great. But I suspect that's not going to happen. No, absolutely. The scheme, not only just in terms of the pension, it provides also lots of other family benefits. And hopefully you never need to use them. But, doctors will know people go off on ill health, people die in service. And it gives an element of financial protection there for people. Not everything you necessarily need in the younger ages, but actually it goes a long way to providing that protection for you. So, if you are thinking of pulling out the scheme, then you have to strongly consider that. But again, also, less so on the sort of the self-employed GP side, but certainly anyone who's employed through the NHS, there is also an employer contribution as well, which potentially you're going to lose out on the value of. I know in some cases it was commuted into extra pay for people, but actually the value on the pension is still extremely good.
Yeah, and I think Tony made quite a subtle point, but it's a very good one, is that in these career average schemes, those early years of your career, although you're broke, and my first year as a junior doctor was 2008, which is always used as the last year before the pay in real terms just starts sliding off the edge of a cliff. So I've been there, I've felt the squeeze, I know what it's like, but those early years are the most valuable pound for pound, because the way the career average scheme means that, as Tony said, it's like compound interest, it accumulates over time. So pound for pound, those early years of your career are the best value in terms of pension accrued, right? So I think that's a really important message, because now we're going to head into current issues with the NHS pension. The previous section was kind of current issues, but there are a lot of issues still going. And I guess we're going to start. Where do you guys want to start? Do you want to start with McLeod?
Okay, yeah. So McLeod. So we probably just have to do a tiny bit, just kind of history, just so people actually understand what McLeod is. So back in 11-12, we'd obviously kind of seen the financial crash, and government were getting a trifle worried about the cost of our pensions. And to be fair to government, they probably did need looking at. They hadn't been looked at in a while. We were definitely living a lot longer than we were when all of these schemes were set up. So if you're looking at the amount of time people spend contributing in their pension versus how long they're paid in retirement, that had changed drastically and it needed looking at. So a very clever chap called Lord Hutton did a big report of it. I think the coalition government probably wanted them to say, we're going to stop your defined benefit pensions altogether, but Hutton thought that was a step too far. And so the compromise from Hutton was to say, well, you can keep a defined benefit scheme, but we're going to change it from a true final salary, retire at 60, typically, for most of the public sector schemes, to a career average revalued earnings. And so it's based on your average salary rather than your final salary. And doctors generally did very well out the final salary arrangement, because just the way that their pay structure is ramped, it generally goes up quite a lot from the junior days, whereas for some staff, if you're a band 5 nurse, your entire career, it's pretty flat. So that was one change. And of course, the other change was to stop the government needing to look at this again and having a fixed pension age and there being wild changes in longevity. They fixed it to state pension age, so that became a movable target. Now, really importantly as well, I'm not going to go into the technical detail of this, but they introduced something called a cost cap. And the cost cap essentially was to give surety to the taxpayer that they would remain affordable. Yeah, so when you see the right-wing media in particular spouting nonsense that they're affordable, that was looked into a long time ago, and they were affordable and they remain affordable. And at the other side of that equation was meant to be a protection that they remain fair to the employee. And the cost cap operates every 4 years in an evaluation cycle. And actually, in the 2 valuation cycles since the 15 schemes came in, there's been a cost cap floor breach, which should have triggered an increase in benefits. But in both cases, the government wiggled out of that. So again, just more, fire back on the narrative that these schemes are unaffordable. It's complete nonsense. And so that's not an issue at all. So the outcome of the Hutton report is we moved over to the care scheme. And in Hutton's report, he warned the government, do not give older members any protections because they don't need them, because they've got loads of legacy service and that's comfort enough for them. And of course, government ignored them and they gave older members those protections. And then a very bright judge called Victoria McLeod sued the government over that because she was a younger judge. And it was reported that the judge said it was the best argued case that they'd ever seen. And that went to all the levels of appeal, and the government lost. And so we have the McLeod Remedy. And the McLeod Remedy has 2 parts, basically. So the first part was to remove the discrimination. And they removed the discrimination by rolling everybody back for this 7-year period from the 2015 scheme into whatever their legacy scheme was, be that the 1995 or the 2008 scheme. Now, for 90% of members not affected by annual allowance, that's a kind of non-issue, that rollback, because they don't really have to address that 7-year period until they retire. But for those 10% of higher earners, it's a massive problem because it introduces enormous complexity, because that 7-year period from 2015 to 2022 has had a ton of change. So we didn't have the taper in 15-16, and then we had the transitional year where we changed into tapering, and then we had the annual allowance compensation scheme for those in England and Wales, and then we had the initial taper tweak in the March 23 budget. So it's incredibly complex. And in addition to that, they then had to delay the administration for the 22-23 tax year. So that also had to be assessed within that kind of 8-year tax period. So it's basically like having to put in 8 tax returns, 7 amended tax returns and 1 new tax return for the 22-23. So that's enormous complexity and it's ultra specialist work. And, my strong advice is anyone affected by that gets an RPSS that needs work on that should use a specialist chartered accountant for that, because it's very specialist and difficult work and easy to get wrong. The second bit to McLeod comes at what happens when you retire. And this is something that the BMA fought for, called deferred choice underpin. The government wanted everyone to decide immediately whether they wanted those 7 years to be in one scheme or the other. And everyone automatically assumes, everyone would want their legacy scheme, right? But actually, it's much more complicated than that, because no one knows what's going to happen to inflation, because the 2015 scheme is inflation protected. No one knows if anything is going to happen to state pension age. And no one really knows exactly when they're going to retire. So we pushed very strongly for deferred choice underpin. And basically, that means when you retire, you get a piece of paper called an RSS, a remedial service statement, and then it shows you what it looks like by just moving those 7 years, into your old scheme or into your new scheme, and then people can make a decision around that. And again, that's something that people may need to access financial advice over, and both of those bits of advice, the accountant bit and the IFA bit, are covered by something called the cost claim back scheme, so people can claim back the costs of needing, specialist advice for both of those things from the government, because ultimately it's from the government's discrimination. So that's kind of McLeod in a nutshell, but I could spend a couple of hours talking about McLeod. And if you look at my YouTube channel, you can see me spending a couple of hours with Andy and others talking about McLeod. But that's McLeod in a nutshell.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a couple of hours talking about McLeod, but there are some kind of current issues. And I mean, at some point, Andy and you, Tony, get to say, I told you so, because that was how McLeod's supposed to work. How's it going?
Yeah, so the admin side, there are problems. There are big problems. And so let's put it like this. So later this afternoon, I'm going to the dentist. And straight after the dentist, I've got a meeting with the Department of Health and the BSA and PCSE. And one of those meetings is going to be like pulling teeth. And so there are big problems with pension administration, none more so than for GPs. So around half of GPs don't even have an up-to-date pension record for which they can then get the statement they need to sort out that rollback issue, RPSS, which is disgraceful, right? Yeah. How can a half of GPs not have their records up to date so that they can sort out their tax position, and then also what they're going to do? Are they staying in the scheme? Are they not? Are they going to private pensions? People need this information to be able to make decisions, and the RPSS process, even for non-GPs, has been a complete disaster. And so all of these statements were meant to start coming out, we were told initially, in April of last year. The statutory deadline, the absolute long stop, they have to be issued, was October of last year, October 2024. And here we are, July 2025, and there's still thousands and thousands of these statements that haven't been issued, and lots of statements that were wrong. It's been a big issue. So kind of around all of these issues, we at the BMA asked the scheme to report themselves to the regulator, which they did. And, we've been working intensively with the schemes to try and help them get to a better place on admin. I had a meeting this morning, for an hour with the head of NHS Pensions and his team, and we are trying to work with them to better the situation and move towards a situation where a lot of it is digitized. And so we're not waiting for brown envelopes, and it's going to be in a portal, it's going to be there on time, and it's going to be right. We're a long way from delivering that.
And so
I'll let Andy comment as well, because I'm sure he's got a lot to say on those
definitely.
issues.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on the GP side, it's something I've lived with for too long now. I had various meetings with PCSE as well, and they're all really nice people. Let's go. There's the individuals trying their best there, but whatever the system isn't working very well. It has improved. I have to say it has improved, but nowhere near the level it needs to be in terms of all the legacy stuff. And frustratingly, there's so much that can be done to simplify this going forward, but no one ever really seems to want to take action on it. And partly, as I think I've described it before, it's partly because we've got this sort of Bermuda Triangle of pensions where you've got PCSE on one side who do the processing side, you've got NHS BSA, and you've also then got the sort of commissioning angle in NHS England, now Department of Health, or combination thereof. And it's quite easy for them to all keep passing the buck that it's someone else's part of the system that's not working. And ultimately, this is a problem. It's causing a major problem. The last thing we want is clinicians to be stressing about what is expected of a pension system, which is just to give them the basic information. I get the one joy of not being in the NHS pension is I can see what my pension's valued at any point in time. It's a fairly live valuation, but I would at least still get a document once a year which actually confirms that and confirms what pension that will buy me if I went down various routes. In the NHS, you're only going to get a statement at best which tells you what you've built up to date, which is fair enough, it's complicated. But secondly, if you can't even access that and you are just having to spend hours trying to rectify a problem. We had, Tommy, within our community this week, we had a query of, a GP going back to 2015-16 being asked to do something that actually isn't required by PCSE. But they were being insisted to fill in a form, but actually didn't relate to what they were doing at that point in time. It's hugely frustrating. So if I could join Tony in his meeting later on, I would do, but I'm not sure I'd add any value of positivity to what's going to come out of that. But so it's a problem. But on the RPSS side, the McLeod side as well, we've been talking about this as a kind of pension community now for what seems an age, in that we were going to get to this point. So a long build up to this point, yet we seem to have more chaos now than actually when we started. I don't know why that is. Tony probably closer to the discussions as to why they've got where they are. But again, it needs resolving, and it needs people to not have to worry about it. And if resolving means we've got to move these deadlines now and remove, any risk of penalties or interest, not that there should be really, because it should all be compensatable, but just move the deadlines to a more realistic amount, realistic date, then that's perhaps what needs to happen. But it's a huge task. It's massive. It's a massive thing.
Just coming back on what the root cause of this, Andy, is that there's not enough money being spent by the schemes on administration. They're not being given enough resource. And so if you compare the NHS BSA, which is obviously administering the biggest DB scheme in Europe, and there's recently been a peer review against other UK public sector schemes, we're spending a ton less money per active member than the other public sector schemes. And so it's being done on a shoestring. And so one is resource and two is expertise. The BSA need to invest in specialist expertise around things like the annual allowance, and they've lost a lot of expertise. A lot of it is being poached into the independent sector by people that set up next door to them, and that's problematic. But hey, that's just the way that the world works. And ultimately, if the BSA want to keep specialists, then they need to pay them appropriately so they're not poached into the private sector. But they need to spend a ton more money on getting a lot more resource in so that they can build the tools so that this becomes easy. And the digitisation is just being woeful. And I met the then head of pensions immediately pre-COVID. I went up to Filed and had a meeting with Chris Dawson and the senior team, and we were promised the world that all annual allowance was going to be on a portal by June of that year in 2020, and everyone was going to have their pension savings statement in a portal. If it wasn't, because for example PCSE didn't have the required information, it would tell them why it's not there. COVID came along, and of course that was a reasonable excuse to bat things back. But look, here we are, 5 years later, and we still don't have that portal. So that's what we're really working with the BSA to try and get delivered as soon as possible, so that we're in a position where we can actually catch up on where admin has gone really badly wrong, because it is poor at the moment. Everyone knows it's poor. The government now knows it's poor and are starting to, hold BSA to account over that. But ultimately, the government have got to put in a solution. They've got to fund the BSA properly by, massively uplifting the amount of money that they spend on administration, and get the people in, get them trained, and deliver the solutions that we all need. Because the bottom line is that, as I've said a few times today, the pension scheme is a good scheme. Yeah. The 2015 scheme is a good scheme. Juniors, everybody else should be in it. It's a good scheme. The government spend a lot of money on this benefit, through employee contributions and then the backing of the taxpayer if there was ever a shortfall. At the moment, it's the other way. 4 billion a year flows back to the Treasury. But they're spending all of this money, but yet we're all very dissatisfied, and a lot of that dissatisfaction comes from maladministration. So they really need to get this right, so people know that it's a good benefit, worth keeping and worth staying in the scheme and worth being in. Because at the moment, there's lots of people who've got a really bad taste in their mouth just from the maladministration. And a big part of that for GPs is the contract with a third party, I'm sure, because there's less GP problems, not no G problems, but there's less GP problems in some of the other nations. And there's also less problems in a similar scheme for dentists. And so we need to find solutions to all of these problems to make pensions great again and let people understand what a brilliant benefit the NHS pension scheme is, and keep as many people as possible in the scheme.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important message. But what we see on the ground is that, if you're putting thousands of pounds into your pension every year, and then PCSE write back to you and say, we got no record of that. Or like Andy, we've just got so many examples. Recently this week, an example of somebody who's on our course and PCSE have told them they need to do one thing, which is completely incorrect information. The net result is that people lose faith and they have a bad taste in their mouth, as Tony said. And the kind of worst possible conclusion of that is that people just think, oh my goodness, I paid thousands into this. I can't get any sensible information out of these people. They don't seem to know what they're doing. I'm done. I'm going to get a private pension. Not financial advice, but I think you're getting the idea that perhaps that may not be a smart move. And that is actually happening, especially for GPs, because it's just so hard to get the data. I mean, I have access to the best specialist medical accountants in the game, and it took me about 9 or 12 months to get my pension record up to date. And I don't know if Andy wants to tell his tale of woe with his wife's NHS pension. I mean, it's in a way, it's embarrassing for him because he's an expert, but it shows just how hard it is, even if you're like one of the best experts in the country, to sort what should be a really simple problem.
Yeah, I mean, my experience actually proves where you can get it right. It does work at the end, because when it actually got to applying for the pension, actually PCSE turned it around within 10 days. That bit was for, it then took another 3 months after that for the NHS BSA side to do anything, but that was another matter. But before that, it was 3 years to resolve one pension issue for 1 year. And basically because one out of hours session she'd worked hadn't been recorded properly, and we'd sent all the forms and we'd sent all the documentation time and time again, and then I had to pull my rank and went straight to the top people and said, but even then they struggled to get it resolved. It took an age. So I pity people trying to do this themselves.
Yeah,
they shouldn't have to.
Even if you pull rank, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, but the chair of Pensions Committee pointed out again to the head of NHS Pensions this morning that he still hasn't got an RPSS. The deputy chair of Pensions Committee, as has Tommy, the deputy chair of Pensions Committee, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying, pointed out to the head of NHS BSA this morning that he's never had a pension savings statement. So it's not just who you are or pulling rank; it's just the whole system is under-resourced and broken, and so they need to just throw money and throw expertise to fix it and make it a ton better, because it's just, obviously it's not a waste of money for the government to spend it on this benefit, but my God, if I was spending X billion pounds on the NHS pension scheme, I would want people to come away and say, this is a really valued part of my reward package, and this is part of the reason why I'm staying in this country and staying in the NHS. Because, there's a lot of reasons for juniors and others to say, well, I'm off to Australia or New Zealand, or, consultants off to the Republic of Ireland where pay is a ton better than it is here. The pension scheme is a really important part of our reward package. So we need to look after it, but we need to administer it properly so people respect that it's a good benefit and they understand it. And if people can't get annual statements that actually mean something and show them what their predicted pension is going to be, then it's back to the drawing board. And people shouldn't have to be constantly, seeking paid advice for that. The scheme needs to pull their weight a bit better and provide better information to all members.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like the subset of people that are listening to this podcast, especially this late into a detailed podcast on pension, in a way, they're the ones ahead of the curve, because they're taking an interest. But there's so many colleagues, I'm sure we all know them, Tony, that, they're just focusing on being a great doctor and they're focusing on medicine and they're not even thinking about this. And then, bam, they just get a random brown envelope or whatever. So just spread the word about all the resources that are out there to help you with this, because it's complicated, as we've learned today. Okay, brilliant. It was so good to have both of you on today. Hopefully this has been super useful. Any kind of parting words of wisdom from both of you or either of you about kind of what doctors should do and just kind of general themes? Yeah,
so that last point you made, Tom, is really important about different types of doctors. And one things that we know about the RPSS is I've done serial FOIs to HMRC. I think I've done 4 or 5 now. There's still a lot of people out there that are sat on their brown envelopes and have done nothing with them, which is just crazy stupid, right? So, and it's crazy stupid for 2 principal reasons. Firstly, most doctors will be in a refund position, yeah? I got a refund of around 30k. I'm working with a firm of ASMA accountants called Forvis Mazars, and I've done all their tools for them. The average refund and / compensation has been around 14k. If you don't process your brown envelope, you are not getting your money back. It's as simple as that. So definitely do not ignore them. I think the other kind of take home point is just get educated. There's loads of good resources. Medics Money have got a ton of great resources. I've just started doing a bit of YouTubing, and I've only done stuff that's been to the accountant sector so far, but I may in the future do some stuff that's kind of direct to client. Get expertise and use expertise, not least because in the context of McLeod, you can get your costs back. So, if it costs you £1,000 to use an ASMA accountant, you get that back from the government. So don't ignore it. Get educated. Try and keep on top of your pension each year. Make sure you get and you download your TRS. Make sure you check your pay slips. Take an interest in your own financial future, because if you don't, no one's doing it for you. And, I wish I'd started my journey even sooner than I did in kind of getting financially educated.
Yeah, really good message. Andy, any parting words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, just looking back over the last 10 years, I would say, things like the annual allowance have improved. It's still a problem, and it's not going to go away. I think where we are financially as a country, it's going to be quite difficult, as Tony probably said, for government to make changes to what are perceived to be high earners tax positions at the moment. But, probably they should do, but that might not happen. But it has improved substantially than where we were, 3 years ago and then prior to that, which means that whilst people are getting caught, it's fewer of them, but you still need to be on your guard, particularly 2024-25 tax year, where people are producing their tax returns. If you are doing your tax return yourself and, you did get a pay uplift, which is more than the inflation in a hospital setting, there could be a risk of annual allowance. So just keep on your guard and watch out for that. But yeah, generally, though, goes back to the core thing about the scheme. It's a really good scheme. May not be as good as it used to be, but, partly that's there's a lot of things aren't as good as they used to be. My hair, for example, has disappeared over time, but, it's not going to come back. But I don't even know why I'm saying that, so let's edit it out.
That's staying in. That's definitely staying in.
Yeah. So, but it's a really good scheme. So, particularly those at the beginning of their career, as, Tony said, I appreciate pressures people are under financially at the moment, particularly with things like student loans, which, our generation didn't have to suffer from. If you can stay in the scheme, because long term, it's going to bring you a lot of benefits. And it will mean that when you're in the later stages of your life, you're not going to be having to worry about retirement.
Yeah. Awesome.
Great advice, Andy.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on today, giving up your time. Yeah, things aren't as good as they used to be, as Andy said. Hopefully Tony's teeth are as good as they used to be, because he's got to get to the dentist and then for a pensions meeting. I will put a link to some resources that you mentioned, Tony's YouTube, the Medics Money resources, and anything else that we can think of to help you. As Tony said, just get educated. No one's going to do this. Well, some people are going to do this for you if you can get money back, but you got to take an interest in this. Even if you just give it all to your accountant and do nothing, I would still advise you to get educated and think about it. So I'll put those links below. Tony, hope the dentist goes okay. Andy, I'll see you in a bit anyway. So yeah, cool. Thanks for watching or listening to this. And of course, if you found this useful, just share it with your colleagues, because there will be colleagues who have buried their head in the sand over this and are just focusing on being great doctors, which is awesome, but they do need to do this. So just share it with one other colleague. Say, I found this useful. I think it explains it really well. And then we'll all be good. Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.